Sculptor, painter, architect, the archetype of the Renaissance man. Michelangelo Buonarroti was a revolutionary artist with a profound influence on architecture. He achieved fame with the Pieta and David, which he sculpted before the age of 30. He painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Last Judgement. Much of his architecture was never built, and if constructed, modified. His design of the Laurentian Library created Mannerist architecture. His efforts freed architecture from slavishly copying classical precedent, transitioning it to a dynamic art form. His architectural career included approximately 30 projects, the most important included here, but his career as an architect wasn't as easy as his sculpture and painting. Michelangelo did not work well with others. His architecture, almost always unfinished, was a series of arguments, disputes with rivals or patrons. This led to drama and conflict on every architectural project he worked on. Michelangelo had a mortal enemy, the architect Bramante. At the start of the Renaissance, there was a revolution brought about by one architect, Donato Bramante. His invention of spatial volume, three-dimensional massing, and perspective illusions distinguishes him from other architects of the time. Bramante rediscovered the lost art of structural concrete of the Romans. The irrational shapes of St. Peter's are impossible without concrete. Bramante created dynamic space and mass, and deep shadows of modeled light. Raphael was the ideal successor to Bramante. He was such a good pupil that his architecture was indistinguishable from his master. Michelangelo's career as an architect began in 1516, after the death of Bramante in 1514. Michelangelo was the new archetype of the Renaissance man who controlled every step, from quarrying the stone to architectural design to carving sculptures with his own hands. For Michelangelo, Laocoon and his sons represented the most important work of art guiding his sculpture and architecture. The sculpture was an ancient Roman sculpture rediscovered in 1506. Michelangelo used it as inspiration for much of his figurative sculpture and paintings throughout his career. The sculpture uses formal subdivision, sometimes called dynamic symmetry. These are controlling lines in painting, sculpture, and architecture. This design technique was rediscovered in the Renaissance and used extensively in architecture. Greek and Roman temples used formal subdivision as a compositional tool. Michelangelo thought of architecture as sculpture. A building was an organic form capable of being molded and carved, expressing movement, forming compositions of light and shadow. It was the human body and the anatomy that forms the basis of architecture, not geometry and number. If we contrast this with Leonardo da Vinci, who used sacred geometry in his work, we can see the two vastly different theories of architecture. One is based on geometry, number, and principles of engineering. The other is based on the human body, human perception, and the expression of human movement, the body's deployment in space. Leonardo innovated the movement away from the planar concept of architecture to a three-dimensional geometry of cubes, cylinders, and spheres. As a result, architects like Bramante abandoned planar design for mass and spatial volume. Michelangelo's process was a radical departure from this theoretical approach. He thought of the building as a dynamic organism. The structural forces such as tension and compression were expressed in human terms. This created a physical and psychological bond between the observer and the object. Michelangelo had two main architectural styles: architecture as drawing and architecture as sculpture. Michelangelo's drawing style was based on his drawing of architectural elements. His strong drawing style is evident in elevations and flat surfaces. His sculptural style transformed from two-dimensional to volumetric. Michelangelo didn't turn to architecture until he was in his 40s. His work on the tomb of Julius II caused him to think of sculpture in relation to architectural elements. From there, it was a short leap into architecture. The Church of San Lorenzo is one of the largest churches in Florence. It was first designed by Filippo Brunelleschi in 1419, but underwent significant changes. At the time of Brunelleschi's death, only the old sacristy had been built. The church contains works of art by Donatello, Verrocchio, and Michelangelo, and many other artists. The main role of Renaissance architects was to design facades. Often this was a separate design than the rest of the building. The facade was often treated as a showpiece for the building, not a logical extension of the structure or spaces within. Space in Rome was conceived of as a series of outdoor rooms called forums. Facades were an exercise in assembling architectural elements into flat compositions of columns, entablatures, and pediments. These were decorative elements from the history of architecture. The architect's role was to draw elevations using architectural vocabulary of ancient Roman temples. Creativity was limited to designing the proportions and ordering the elements. At the Façade of San Lorenzo, Michelangelo attempted to combine architecture and sculpture. Architecture was used as a framework for sculptural compositions. Michelangelo was commissioned to design the sculptures, while others were invited to compete for the architectural facade. Michelangelo's inability to collaborate with anyone won him both jobs. He was appointed architect on the project, although he lacked any architectural experience. But the project was never completed. The Medici Chapel was a copy of Brunelleschi's sacristy at the other end of San Lorenzo, but with a different order of ornamentation provided by Michelangelo. Michelangelo was inventive with architectural elements such as cornices, capitals, and doors. His work inspired generations of architects to break with Vitruvian classical architecture for more creative interpretations of these elements. It encouraged architects to indulge their fantasies, both beautiful and grotesque. The architecture may not shock us today, but at the time, architects were required to obey the laws of classical Roman canon. The ornamental motifs show a cohesive vocabulary Michelangelo used throughout his life. Half-human, half-animal masks give zoomorphic character to his ornamentation. This can be seen in Michelangelo's first painting when he was 12 or 13, The Torment of St. Anthony, that shows various demons. The Medici Chapel is a masterful work of sculpture, but lacks the spatial design of a mature architect. It wasn't until later in Michelangelo's career that he masters architectural space. Architectural elements are mere ornamentation, a veneer of pilasters, blank windows, and doors. Architectural elements are used as a frame for sculptural elements, not to create space or to support structure. Michelangelo had yet to learn architecture. The Laurentian Library was commissioned by the Medici family. The library was enlarged by Lorenzo the Magnificent, giving it the name Laurentian. Michelangelo played with space and form with the staircase and architectural elements. Michelangelo's flat drawing style was appropriate for projects emphasizing architectural ornament, but for the library, spatial design was needed. He de-emphasized the wall as a structural and aesthetic element, and instead emphasized the stairs and movement through the space. The vestibule design developed in the opposite direction from the reading room. This created a juxtaposition between the reading room of flat planes to the vestibule with a massive sculptural staircase. The stairway seems to flow downward from the reading room into the vestibule, taking on an organic, almost lava-like flow. The art of war reached its peak in the Renaissance. Medieval castles and fortifications became obsolete with the invention of heavy artillery. New inventive ideas were needed. Military fortifications were designed by engineer architects like Leonardo da Vinci. Fortification studies can be found in drawings by Leonardo. Later, technical knowledge of weapons and tactics became more important than architectural design. But for a brief time, artists and architects performed as military engineers. This is one of the events in the history of architecture where technology forced new principles in design. Michelangelo stated that although he knew little of painting and sculpture, his experience in military fortifications made him an expert. This was not true, but certainly inventive design was needed. Michelangelo's design is generated from axes. Like his sculpture, he developed axes of force related to artillery fire. While the ballistic forces created axes, the fortresses are created from organic forms derived from them. Michelangelo's bastions spring from the walls, crab-like monsters to crush the enemy with its claws. Although these aggressive biological forms look purely formal, there is practical justification for them. At 59, Michelangelo left Florence in 1534, never to return. None of his architectural works completed. In Rome, new work created unmatched opportunities for him. Michelangelo would spend the rest of his life in Rome. Medieval Rome had no center. While other Italian towns had grown organically from town squares, Rome shrank until major buildings were on the outskirts. The Pope commissioned Michelangelo to move the statue of Marcus Aurelius to the Capitoline Hill. The statue was the symbol of the Roman Empire. The Capitoline Hill overlooked the ancient Roman ruins of the Republican Forum. The oblique elevations of the three buildings created a widening perspective, bringing the Senate building closer, and emphasized the link between the equestrian monument and the stairs. The oval painting motif resolved the problem of making the monument the center point of the piazza. The pavement pattern is designed to integrate the monumental buildings and stairs, giving a center to Rome that it lacked. The concept is axes exploding outward from a central core. The space this creates is a room rather than a complex of buildings. Michelangelo uses building masses to enframe the square, turning it into an outdoor room. The facades of the building are articulated with Michelangelo's signature colossal architectural order. The redesign of the Capitoline Hill created one of the earliest and most influential examples of urban planning. The importance of Marcus Aurelius cannot be overstated. As a Stoic intellectual and Roman emperor, he, more than any other, epitomized Michelangelo's philosophy of life. The Farnese Palace is one of the most important high Renaissance palaces in Rome. It was initially designed by Sangallo the Younger, one of Bramante's students, in 1515. The palace wasn't a home so much as a symbol of the power of the Farnese dynasty. Architecture as propaganda. Florentine merchants used monumental architecture as a symbol of their newfound wealth and power. Michelangelo took over the design of this palace, adding a third story and refining the cornice. He designed the interior courtyard. Michelangelo seems to exercise a kind of spell over Rome. Nowhere is this more evident than St. Peter's. St. Peter's Basilica is a church began in 1506 and was completed in 1626 in Vatican City, Rome. This is the largest church in the world. It is thought to be the burial site of St. Peter, and his tomb is below the high altar of the church. Almost every major architect of 16th century Rome had a hand in designing the basilica, each changing their predecessor's scheme. The evolution of the basilica shows the degree to which Michelangelo's architecture influenced the architecture of the Renaissance. Giuliano di Sangallo was an Italian architect, sculptor, and engineer. He was deeply influenced by Alberti and Brunelleschi, and in turn influenced other Italian architects like Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. The Basilica of St. Peter's was originally designed as a freestanding volume based on a square inscribed with a Greek cross and a hemispherical dome with a number of minor chapels. Giuliano di Sangallo was the first to draw this scheme. Sangallo's composition is unsatisfactory. The cross fails to unify the inner space. Bramante was far more talented than his contemporary, Sangallo. Bramante establishes the High Renaissance style by keeping traditional ideas while developing new forms. Where Sangallo was designing in two-dimensional circles and rectangles, Bramante designed space and volumetric solids like cylinders and cubes. Geometric solids were used to mold light and shadow to give mass and body to building elements. Where Sangallo drew forms, Bramante modeled them. Bramante uses the cross as a main organizational element, creating a clear spatial hierarchy and linking all the subordinate spaces together. Although the church has complex articulation, the final form is based on a simplification and clarity of space. Space dominates as the organizational principle, not physical or geometric forms. Although this is a development in Renaissance architecture, it also has precedent in Roman architecture, where spaces and voids are manipulated to create spatial volumes. Pope Paul III wanted to appoint Michelangelo as master architect when all the previous architects had died. Michelangelo repeatedly refused, saying he was not an architect. It was only after seeing the model of the building, Michelangelo thought there were too many registers, columns, and decorative elements. He decided to take on the project to reduce its complexity and simplify the plan. He simplified Bramante's original idea of a major Greek cross surrounded by smaller ones into a Greek cross superimposed over a square ambulatory, not dissimilar to Sangallo's original plan. In the new plan, every space is connected to the central space, creating spatial unity. In looking at the three main plans together, one can see how it developed from a Greek cross with a side square ambulatory to a complex series of simultaneous spaces under Bramante. Finally, Michelangelo simplifies the spaces back into a central space with a square side ambulatory. The final plan modified all previous central plans into a longitudinal composition, destroying Michelangelo's bold central synthesis around a dome. This shifted the focus from the central dome as Michelangelo intended to a longitudinal plan that focuses on moving through the central space. In St. Peter's, the colossal order is purely expressive, supporting nothing. It is used to visually draw the eye to the dome. Michelangelo designed the dome, the most iconic feature of the basilica. Its design was completed after his death by others. Michelangelo looked to Brunelleschi's dome for inspiration. In Brunelleschi's dome, there is an interdependence between form and structure. In the more than 100 years since Brunelleschi, Renaissance architects became obsessed with recreating fake Roman antiquity using stucco or painted veneer surfaces. Michelangelo's decorative works were not real structure, but spoke to real structural forces of the building. The Basilica of San Giovanni de Fiorentini is a minor church in Rome. Its name means St. John the Baptist, the protector of Florence. Michelangelo was commissioned in 1556 to provide the designs for the church. These were never used, but show us Michelangelo's conception of spatial design. For the Renaissance architect, a central plan with a simple geometric figure of a square or rectangular polygon was the preferred method of design. The difference between Michelangelo and other architects of his time is he sketches axes, spaces, and movement lines of force with little care for the geometry. All major lines are constructed radially from the center of the circle. What at first appears to be squares and circles are on closer inspection axes of radial lines originating from a central point. Michelangelo's design uses dynamic symmetry, using axes versus regular geometric shapes. This implies movement and disrupts the stability of the circle or square. By the superimposition of two pairs of cross axes, dynamic movement is established. His axes are not lines, but directional space. There is a tension between equal and opposite forces. Historically, the Porta Pia was one of the northern gates of Rome. In 1562, Pope Pius IV commissioned architects to create a grand street and gate. He named the gate after himself. He commissioned Michelangelo for the gate design. According to Façade, Michelangelo presented 3 designs to the Pope, and he picked the cheapest of the 3. Construction began in 1561 and ended in 1565 after Michelangelo's death. The current design of the Porta Pia is not the original plan by Michelangelo, having been changed many times over the years. The most authentic design is perhaps the commemorative coin minted in 1561 that shows the Porta Pia on the reverse side. Here is my drawing of what it must have looked like. What is most likely is the decorative elements like windows and sculptures were designed by Michelangelo, but these have been rearranged and reimagined by many other architects. The impact of Michelangelo's architecture was to create a high Renaissance style called Mannerism and ushered in the Baroque. This included visual tricks and unexpected elements that challenged Renaissance norms. Under Michelangelo's influence, the late Renaissance transformed architecture into monolithic sculpture, sculpting space as if it was a statue carved from a marble block. Michelangelo created the gigantic or colossal order of decorative elements in large pilaster columns that were copied by generations of architects as the high Renaissance style. Michelangelo's innovative merging of sculpture, painting, and architecture influenced Baroque architects. It freed up architects to innovate and experiment instead of slavishly following the historical precedent of classical architecture. This led to the development of Baroque architecture, where forms undulate and morph before one's eyes. Michelangelo directly inspired Baroque architects with this technique. Bernini stood on the shoulders of Michelangelo. He fused sculpture with monumental architecture. Michelangelo's development as an artist had him abandon figurative art for architecture in the last decades of his life. Eventually, he abandoned architecture for a pure philosophy of art. The ultimate creative act was the conception of art through drawing and writing, not the finished object. I'm Jaime Roberts. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe.